Thank you, Madam President and trustees. I really appreciate the Performance Committee working their way through this presentation, and especially appreciate our parents who came and spoke earlier this evening regarding concerns around student behavior in our classrooms. We understand the importance of positive and productive behavior from students and adults to improve teaching and learning. We also understand the negative impact, trustees, of out-of-school suspension. So it was 8 years ago when the district set this as a priority, and trustees, not everyone was on the board at that time, not everyone even lived in the community at that time. But back in those days, 1 of 4 African-American middle school students was being suspended at least 1 time per year, and 1 in 5 special needs students the same way. So at that time, the superintendent called the truth, and we began this work. And you will see this evening a sustained pattern of reducing out-of-school suspensions. I do want to point out, and I left the book over on the table, but President Mitchell can hold it up, coming to you soon, and thanks to the Planning Committee who plowed through that improvement plan for special education, and we're, at their encouragement, we're working now to receive input and feedback from staff on that plan before it comes to the board. I had a great meeting on last Monday afternoon, 2 days ago, with the special education work team, and I appreciate their work on that. And I do understand that a lot of the concerns where we see high level behavior needs emerging, particularly at a very young age, some of that is with regular education students. So we do hear the concern of needing supports across the continuum throughout our schools. And yet, trustees, I just want you to know that that plan, even though it's a special ed plan, will include some action planning steps around attending to the kinds of concerns that you heard about this evening. We have a lot of work to do, and as you've heard from Mr. Demetrio, we'll have to be doubly smart to find the funding because it is not apparent where that will come from. But we do recognize that we continue to experience a challenge in our classrooms, and we want you to know there's a pattern emerging on the special ed education action plan. That being said, though, this report is really about out-of-school suspensions. Each spring, we bring you the annual report on out-of-school suspensions. We know that if a child is suspended at any point in their middle school or high school career, their chance of graduating on time is automatically diminished. We know that from decades of research. We know that if they are suspended during their middle school years, the data tells us they are 4 times more likely to not graduate on time. So you will hear from our executive directors this evening. This report and the evidence of the reduction of suspensions, trustees, it does not mean that children are all over the city behaving entirely differently or better. Certainly, we hope that we're providing more supports and they're doing better. But what this report does shine a light on is a shift to restorative and practices to support kids, to support students ahead of the problem, not to wait for the problem. And then once a problem emerges, not seeing out-of-school suspension as the only hammer and every issue with the child as the nail, but to see that there are a variety of interventions and supports that can be provided other than out-of-school suspension. So we have shifted to more restorative practices. You will see that we have dramatically reduced our out-of-school suspension rates. Another flag I want to raise, though, And Trustee Lightfoot always reminds us, as do several trustees, to call out the challenges, so I'll do that right up front. Our challenges are clear in this report, and that is in 3 areas, trustees, where we see remaining disparities. The top disparity in this data is students who have an IEP, special needs students. The second one is with our economically disadvantaged students. And the third group in the order of that disparity is with African American students. So you will see that throughout this annual report. Trustees, we see that truth, we speak that truth, we continue our work to support students and to ensure that we're doing everything we can to reverse that data. We know that an 8-year trend of reduction continues because of our teachers, our staff in the building, our leaders across our schools, and trustees, the 3 P12 executive directors, teachers, staff, building leaders, and the 3 K-12 executive directors. They are on the front lines every day with this work. And I just want to give those folks a shout out. It is imperfect work, but we are making progress. We'll go quickly through the data, and we'll be happy to accept and respond to any questions that you have. High school suspension trend, you can see here, over 8 years reduced by 45%, just about half from 6% to a little over 3%. We look beyond that, though, to say, how are we doing with student groups, and where do our disparities exist? As we said earlier, you see there special education students, students with special needs, economically disadvantaged, and African American students. We're also mindful, as is true across the country, of a distinction between boys and girls. Pretty consistently, boys being suspended out of school at about twice the rate of girls. We are mindful of that. We do know that education is teachers and others in our system are predominantly female. And we are very mindful and aware that sometimes we need to adjust our strategies to ensure that we're meeting the needs of boys in our environment. When you look at the next 2 slides, and trustees, we have your packet where hopefully you could look at these 2 slides side by side, but I just want you to see, we put them in, the first slide is by race ethnicity group, and you can see there the disparity that we referred to earlier, but you can also see the progress in each of those groups over time. When we shared this data with Performance Committee, they asked a critical question, and that is, how are we coming with disproportional identification? And I know other trustees have asked me personally that question. We don't know that answer yet, and yet we do understand that unlike any district surrounding us, we are much more at risk for disproportional identification because of the many, many groups that we have. And trustees, that will always be a battle that we fight, because the lower we drive these rates, we're still judged by the disproportionality. So trustees, if you ever want, we'll share with you the algorithm that the state uses so that you see that it is a continuing challenge. When you look at the next slide, you can see there our highest group at high school, students with special needs, and then economically disadvantaged. You can see over time in every group we've reduced, and yet you see some areas popping up over the recent year somewhat. Behind each of these areas is a chart. Trustees, these annual reports, as you know, are very carefully curated as our committees say, well, why don't you take that graph and put it in numbers so I can see how many students were impacted in this data. So that is your chart where the numbers actually represent what's going on. If that number is fewer than 10, we just note it as such because we never want to violate FERPA and have our data reveal the identity of a student. High school suspension rates, I want to look at some of the areas looking at students versus non-students in the category. And this is really to look at what is the disparity, not student group to student group, but target group to non-target group. So you can see there, when we look at the data that way, special education students at 10.4% and non-special education students at 2.4%. So there is a significant disparity there. And we'll go over and do a similar analysis with economically disadvantaged. These are students who are qualified, who do qualify for free or reduced lunch. We know that students are less likely to fill out that paperwork in high school. If they've started with a part-time job, many of them would rather spend their own discretionary money that they may be earning babysitting rather than to fill out the paperwork. So we already know that this data is skewed at high school more so than in the younger years, but you see the dramatic disparity there, 8.8%. For economically disadvantaged and 1.6% for those who are not. We'll move over and take a quick look at boys and girls. You can see that's exactly as we discussed it, about 2 times the rate for boys at high school. Let's move to middle school. Middle school has shown the most dramatic percentage reduction, a reduction of 75% decrease over the last 8 years. I gave a shout out to our teachers, our staff, our building leaders, our executive directors. On this slide, I especially want to call out our behavior interventionists who have taken on that caseload of approximately 20 students in each school. Those are the 20 to 25 students who are most likely to struggle with behavior in the environment, and they are on the direct caseload of our behavior interventionists. It takes a whole team to get this work done, and we are getting it done at middle school. Here's the snapshot at middle school of our overall picture. As you can see, a similar pattern, although not as dramatic. Special education students at 6.1%, African American students at 5.1%, and economically disadvantaged at 4.8% of students experiencing 1 suspension during the school year. When we look at middle school by student group, the disparities are smaller. They are a narrower difference across the groups. We'll go right on to the other 4 areas we keep our eye on, and you can see there, again, special education, economically disadvantaged, and then boys also running at about 2 to 1. So pretty consistent data. Let's look at the comparison to the special education to non-special education students. You can see there 6% to 1.4%. And then we'll move to economically disadvantaged, 4.8% to 0.8% non-economically disadvantaged students. Trustees, what you see here in all of this data is an 8-year sustained change. We have changed the DNA of the organization. It was not so long ago that you can see 1 in 5 of our students were experiencing an out-of-school suspension. We've altered the DNA. What we still have left to do is to build an even fuller network of supports for each and every child on every day to ensure that they're getting that help ahead of the problem instead of a reactive response after the problem. So we'll move then to get ready to have our team share how they're achieving this data. The first half of the annual report, as is customary, is a glance at the data. We've been deep into this. I do want to remind folks that our executive directors review with the principals on a monthly or even more often basis exactly what's going on in the school, where the data is, where their challenges are. Trustees, some of the analyses are down to what location in the building is generating the most discipline referrals or issues. They are mapping geographically, they are looking at the nature of the concerns, all with an eye toward providing more support ahead of the issue in order to continue to reduce. Trustees, I do want to point out one thing, and then we'll turn it over to our team. It's on the next slide. There it is. We really believe in 4 steps. There are 3 here, and I'll throw in a 4th one. We believe that it is about equity, providing every student the supports they need. You could hear from the parents this evening, and it is absolutely true. Some students need far more support in order to, as the school teams say, in order to do school on any given day. So we believe in that equity approach. We know the power of relationships, that without a relationship in the school for the student, that someone in that school knows their story, knows them by strength, by name, and by need. Without that relationship, we're not going to make a difference. And thirdly, I want to share this progressive model. I think in addition to the restorative work, we really are focusing on a progressive model. So out of school suspension is not a one-size-fits-all for any concern that comes up in the school. We are working through a progressive model of more support to ensure that students have every opportunity to learn, because at its heart, student contact and student discipline is about the teachable moment and ensuring that our students are learning from the experiences they have in school so that they can do better the next time, whether that next time is a school situation, whether it's a neighborhood or home situation, or out in the community. I was a teacher for 13 years, worked in school-based leadership for 8 years. I never will forget saying to parents who were distraught at the time of a discipline occurrence, reminding them, school is the best place to learn this lesson. Let's have the student learn the lesson now in school, because school will help, our team will help them learn how to do better in the future. And you know, when they get out beyond graduation, the world is not always so kind in teaching those lessons. So we believe it's about the teachable moment. Trustees, the executive directors are coming to share some of the many strategies that we've used over 8 years. The more we do, the more we need to do, the more we recognize that we need to do. So trustees, what we've said to schools is every single campus will deploy a behavior plan. And we've allowed them to choose the plan that best fits their community, their staff, their students. So you may walk into one school and they may be participating in a mindfulness technique. You may walk into another school and see the posters on the wall of positive behavior supports. You know those posters when you see them because they say, here's how we behave in the library. Here's how we behave in the cafeteria. You know what PBIS looks like. If you head into Lawton or Dickin, you'll see all of the evidence of Leader in Me, which is another nationally recognized program developing leadership in students. All of the programs on our menu are research-based. They are all sound programs. And what we say to our staffs and to our teams in schools is every school will be on a path, will be in a program, and we allow them to work with their executive director to find that best match and that best fit. So I appreciate the opportunity to share the data, and I am just the warm-up act for sharing what are the strategies that we have used, what strategies are we continuing to use, and where are our challenges that we continue to face. Thank you.
Good evening, trustees. It's our pleasure to be here, and thank you, Dr. Swift, for that great overview. I think we'll be brief because you've seen and heard a little bit about what we're about to share, but on the elementary side, I'll go ahead and begin. Positive behavior supports are a required piece by the state of Michigan, but they're also really impactful on student behavior. So what PBS really means is that we're instructing students on clear expectations for how to behave together in the school environment. Anytime you bring together hundreds of children under one roof, the clarity of expectation is really important. So PBIS is a method where schools make those things very clear. The lessons are taught to students, they practice them, they rehearse them, and when they need a reteach, they reteach them. But the positive piece of this is that we attempt to, in our schools, use 4-to-1 praise. So for every redirection, we're trying to recognize the positives. So that's where the positive piece on PBIS comes from. Because if you focus on what you want, that's where the attention goes, right? So that's a big important part of it. I think if I were to summarize PBIS, I would say it's about reinforcing positive behavior and clarity of expectation. A number of our schools also implement a program called Responsive Classroom. And you've heard us talk about this before, but I think it's worth talking about a little more because we're investing as a district in every elementary teacher being trained in these techniques because we've seen such positive impact. Responsive Classroom is about the common language that teachers use. It is about how teachers and staff interact together with each other and with students. And it is completely based in creating a culture in the school that students feel they are significant and that they belong and that they are important. And those are all things that resonate with us and that we know our children desperately need. It improves relationships between staff and students. And this approach, in terms of how students and staff to staff interact with each other, has really been key in reducing some of the significant behaviors that I think you heard speakers talk about tonight. And hence, it's a thing we're investing in for all teachers. Up until now, it's been an option and a choice. Another really nice option we have that 2 of our schools take advantage of, and Dr. Swift has already mentioned, is Leader in Me. This program is really about empowerment. So this is about teaching students the 7 habits, how to be highly effective, and also how to take the lead and how to advocate for themselves. And it is a really great program to see in action. It's really fun to see the students at both Dickin and Lawton taking control of school assemblies and owning the processes and solving problems and bringing those to leadership, not just with problems, but also with solutions they're proposing. So it's a really nice addition to the menu. Another piece that you'll see in some of our elementary schools is mindfulness. You've probably seen and heard about mindfulness in the community, but at the school level, this is really about teaching students how to be self-aware and how to self-regulate. So for some of our younger students, this can be really challenging. And so it's helping them to be in a place of calm and to recognize when they're feeling themselves become frustrated or angry. It's giving them techniques for how to calm down and to make decisions from a place of calm, which is, of course, the best place to make a decision from. And you'll see there in the center of our graphic, these peer-to-peer programs are also a really important part of building school culture. These are programs specifically designed to connect students with special needs with peers. And we're really proud of those programs. They're important because every single student is a general education student and is significant and valued in our environment. So I'm going to hand this over to Ms. Jazz Parks.
Good evening, trustees. To talk a little bit about the middle school programming that we have, we also have peer-to-peer at the middle school, but what we have trained a few students in each of our 5 comprehensive middle schools in is that peer mentoring through the U of M Depression Center and our partnerships with some of our community organizations. Students in each of the 5 middle schools are being trained as peer mentors, so how to engage early on peer-to-peer around conflict management, things of that nature. And so those are both special education and general education students who are able to engage in that process with each other peer-to-peer. One of the things right here at Forsyth that students are using around that peer mentoring piece is Where Everyone Belongs, or WEB, and that's where students have, students in the upper grades, 8th grade, have a 6th or 7th grade mentor or mentee that they help transition to middle school. And so that's a wonderful program here at Forsyth. All of the middle schools and as well as one of the K-8 schools also implement developmental designs. But developmental designs is that proactive, preventative piece that we build in to try to teach students skills on the front end so that when conflict arises, and it will, I mean, they're adolescents, they have a toolkit to go to or toolbox to go to of skills. So teachers and administrators are very intentional about working with students to develop self-control, cooperation skills, empathy, things of that nature, as well as helping students to find a way to meet their need for autonomy and independence, but also have that component of responsibility that we need for them to have in our school learning communities as well. And that encompasses students in the larger groups. So we have a smaller group of students who are supported by our intervention specialists. And so they work with a smaller caseload, if you will, of students, about 22 to 25 students who have some of those more intensive behaviors, who tend to have a lot of background in trauma. We find that in working with students from these backgrounds, their families are in trauma. And so our intervention specialists and our administrators are working not just with students, they're working with families as well. They are partnering with community agencies like our community centers across town to really provide that full wraparound support for our students both during the school day and outside of the school day, because we know students aren't able to let go of things that happen at home when they hit the schoolhouse door. And so we try to make sure that we're wrapping around and supporting those students fully both during and after the school day. Mr. DeAngelis will talk a little bit about what that looks like at the high school level that we're seeing some really positive success with.
Good evening. Just a couple of things I want to touch on, because much of what has already been spoken to are things that we're working on at the high schools, but the key to the work that we're doing at the high schools is really around the restorative pieces and recognizing, and I think we're doing a much, much better job of this, is recognizing that when we see behaviors, troubling behaviors in students, that much of that comes from trauma that they're dealing with. And so rather than look at these things as discipline, we're looking at these as signs that the student just needs more support. And I think we've heard that message from my colleagues here tonight. And so an example of that is with the commitments that we've made with some additional counseling and with our 9th grade deans. Because we see most of these troubling behaviors in students happening in the 9th grade, the fact that we have people, additional resources, and people trained in restorative practices, as well as identifying when students need supports, whether those be mental health supports or other types of supports, we're doing a much better job of identifying that. So while at the high school level in the 17-18 school year, we saw a slight uptick in suspensions, what we're not seeing, and what I can report about this year, is we're not seeing students repeatedly getting into trouble. Fewer times are we seeing students get into trouble because we're able to identify the supports that they need and put those supports in place. I think the regular check-ins that we're doing through our ninth grade deans and the additional counseling support to do quarterly and even more frequent, sometimes weekly check-ins with students, especially those who demonstrate that they need more support from us, is making a tremendous impact on making sure that we're not seeing repeated behaviors. I can tell you that in my first year here, that was probably the most troubling thing, and the thing that I brought back to Dr. Swift about needing some additional support was, especially early on in the high school career, was students trying to adjust to ninth grade and us not being able to provide as much support as we wanted to be able to provide to them. And now that those supports are in place, now that we have systems in place, through the work of those deans, through the work of the counselors, through the work of psychs and social workers and everybody else that's in the building, we're really able to identify early on students that need additional support and reduce the frequency in which students are needing disciplinary intervention.
Thank you all for coming out, your time and attention to this matter, all the hard hours of work. It's really appreciated. And we'll take this, and we still have work to do. So thank you again.